You're making me angry, America. You're making me really angry. Donald Trump telling NBC News he's seriously considering running for a third term and that there are ways around that pesky little constitutional amendment that forbids him from running for a third term. How does he do it? Cancel the 2028 election through emergency decree. Right now, Donald Trump is invoking his emergency powers under the Enemy Aliens Act in order to deport migrants to El Salvador. There are several hundred emergency powers at a president's disposal. On January 6 of 2021, the Oath Keepers showed up to Washington, D.C. fully armed, assuming Trump was going to invoke emergency powers under the Insurrection Act. I told you right after Kamala Harris conceded that we have to fight Trump on the migrants. The emergency powers he invokes to detain the migrants, that is a dress rehearsal. It's all a dress rehearsal. Massive Tesla takedown demonstrations around the world, especially here in the United States, outside Tesla dealerships, protesting Elon Musk slashing America's social safety net. 277 Tesla dealerships here in America, 230 around the world were inundated with protesters holding up signs that read, "Honk if you hate Elon." Tesla stock down 1.6% on Monday, despite the Dow Jones Industrial Average up 1%. Tesla's stock down nearly 50% since Trump took office. Ashley St. Clair, who claims Musk is the father of her baby son, publicly sold her $100,000 black Model S Tesla on Saturday while calling Musk a vindictive billionaire. She said, "I'm selling it because I need to make up for the 60% cut that Elon made to our son's child support." If this is how Elon Musk allegedly treats one of his 12 or 14 kids, do you think he really cares what happens to you? Musk saying he doesn't blame Americans for vandalizing Teslas. He blames the people pushing the propaganda against him. Nobody's pushing propaganda. They're just repeating what you've said and what you've done, like getting rid of U.S. aid, calling it a criminal organization that must be killed, calling Social Security a Ponzi scheme, flashing the Nazi salute twice, supporting Alternative for Germany, and then telling Germans they have to stop feeling guilty about the Holocaust, hiring self-professed racists and white nationalists to pour through our government databases, spreading election conspiracy lies, buying the presidency for Donald Trump, and referring to our entire social safety net as financial slavery. Nobody needs to spread propaganda about Elon Musk. He's doing it all by himself. All we need to do is report what Elon Musk says and does. Appearing on Fox News, Mr. Champion of the First Amendment, Elon Musk, had this warning for people trash-talking him.
It's the people pushing the propaganda that caused that guy to do it. Those are the real villains here. And we're going to go after them. And the president's made it clear we're going to go after them. The ones providing the money, the ones pushing the lies and propaganda, we're going after them.
That's tough talk from a guy who can only conceive through in vitro fertilization, allegedly. The Food and Drug Administration vaccine chief, Dr. Peter Marks, has resigned, blaming his new boss, Health and Human Service Administrator Bobby Kennedy Jr., who Dr. Marks, in a parting shot, called irresponsible and a danger. The Centers for Disease Control reporting nearly 500 cases of the measles across the country. 75% of the patients are children, 97% of them unvaccinated. Measles eradicated 25 years ago, but has returned thanks to anti-vaxxers like Bobby Kennedy spreading lies linking the vaccine to autism. Despite Bobby Kennedy Jr. testifying during his confirmation hearings that he wouldn't deter parents from getting vaccines, since taking over HHS, Kennedy has ordered the CDC to tell parents that getting their children vaccinated is a personal choice to be discussed with a family doctor. Kennedy's delayed the CDC's measles risk assessment. That's in an attempt to downplay the spread. He has suspended more than 40 vaccine research grants, postponed the meeting of the Vaccine Advisory Group. They meet once a year to plan vaccines for next year's flu season. He's postponed that meeting. He announced plans to study the link between autism and vaccines, despite it being settled law that there is none. And he canceled the Department of Health and Human Services vaccine awareness campaigns. He's also begun advocating for something called vaccine injury compensation claims, making it easier for people to sue claiming they were injured by taking a vaccine. Kennedy has also fired 10,000 employees of Health and Human Services. That's nearly 1/4 of the entire agency. When he began working there, 82,000 were employed. His plan to bring it down to 62,000. The Guardian reporting that Democratic Senator Patty Murray, the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, she's now accusing Kennedy of signing off on these firings. She says it's all part of the Republican Party's grand plan to privatize government services. And when you privatize government services, you make them less efficient and more expensive. The war on government workers continues. Donald Trump signing an executive order ending collective bargaining rights for 1 million federal workers. Those with jobs in Defense, Homeland Security, and several other agencies have lost their right to negotiate collectively as Donald Trump's new order claims that under the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act, a president is permitted to deny collective bargaining rights for any job he deems essential to our national security. And what better way to make our nation secure than by paying the people who keep us safe as little as possible? The Republican-controlled Senate voted to reverse Joe Biden's rule that caps a bank's overdraft fees at $5. Before Biden began regulating junk fees, banks could charge more than $35 if you bounced a check. Trump is expected to sign this new bill that removes the cap, something banks have been lobbying hard for, because overdraft fees bring in billions of dollars each year in profits. Senate Banking Committee Chairman Republican Tim Scott pushed hard for reversing the cap. He called Biden's war on junk fees politically motivated, as opposed to this bill, which is motivated purely by love of country. Scott called removing the cap on overdraft fees, quote, good for consumers. If you're a consumer shopping for a politician, how is it good for consumers? It's good for donations to Tim Scott from the banking industry. Scott said the only reason Biden capped overdraft fees was to distract Americans, to distract us away from our country's crippling inflation. Let's see. Biden brings down the cost of a bounced check from $35 to $5. He lowered the cost of a bounced check by more than 1,000%, but somehow he's distracting our attention away from inflation. Do you even know what inflation is, Tim Scott? Inflation, by the way, is caused by what we allow corporations to get away with, like charging $35 for a bounced check. That cap on junk fees was initiated by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was set up by President Obama in the aftermath of the financial crisis. It was set up to protect Americans from predatory banks and lenders. Donald Trump attempted to zero out the budget for the Bureau, and he attempted to fire everyone, but on Friday, a judge blocked him. Agencies, commissions, bureaus established by acts of Congress can only be closed through an act of Congress. All federal agencies, commissions, and bureaus, yes, they are nested inside the executive branch. That only means the president has some latitude in hiring and firing, as well as issuing some rules and directives in the day-to-day operations of these agencies, bureaus, and commissions. Hence, he's called the chief executive. He's the executive. But Congress is kind of like the stockholder, the board of directors. Congress allocates the money and can specify how that money is spent, and they can specify what goes on inside those agencies. It is the Office of the Management and Budget inside the White House that is tasked with obeying the annual budget passed by Congress and seeing to it that each federal department gets the money allocated by Congress and is spending it according to the wishes of both the president and our Congress. The president cannot unilaterally dismantle an agency, and he must spend the money Congress allocates on the things Congress specifies. But right now, Russell Vought, one of the Christian nationalists behind Project 2025, Vought is running the Office of Management and Budget. He has said during his confirmation hearings that it's the president, not Congress, that gets to decide how the entire budget is spent. He's also been put in charge of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He's letting workers go and telling the ones remaining to stop whatever it is they're doing. The Supreme Court on Friday temporarily stopped him. Donald Trump signed an executive order mandating proof of citizenship in order to vote in a federal election. You might remember in the lead up to the 2024 presidential election, Trump and Musk were claiming that millions of migrants were flooding the borders in order to vote for Kamala Harris. Zero evidence of non-citizens voting in federal elections. Zero. This is the voter fraud lie. Why do they spread the lie? Because they want to pass laws making it harder for marginalized communities to vote. They want voter ID. Voter ID requires a driver's license. And if you don't own a car, if you take mass transit, how do you prove you're a resident? And now, how do you prove you're an American citizen? Can you do it? Do you have a passport? Do you know where your birth certificate is? I guess in some states, if you have a driver's license, that could be proof of citizenship, although some states give driver's license to undocumented workers. The idea is to make it harder for people to vote, especially marginalized communities. That's the idea behind all of this. So this executive order will be challenged in our courts. And this is the dysfunction we have in Washington, D.C. Congress refuses to pass any meaningful legislation. So what we're left with is a president who governs through edict, through executive order, and then 9 Supreme Court justices decide whether that order is constitutional. That's what we've got basically right now. According to The Guardian, there are 130 lawsuits challenging Trump's most recent executive orders. You can track all of them over justsecurity.org. Every day they update the status of these lawsuits. There are 2 types of coups d'etats. There's the kind where a general just invades the presidential palace, announces martial law, and takes over. Then there's what we've got going on right now, the slow motion coup, where power is slowly concentrated in one branch of government as democracy imperceptibly slips away. Ancient Rome, under the Caesars, still had a Senate. After the Enabling Act was passed in 1933, Hitler's first year, Enabling Act passed in 1933, the Reichstag pretty much rubber stamped whatever he ordered, but there was still a Reichstag. If you squinted, you could still see a legislative branch throughout most of Hitler's reign. There were still elections in Nazi Germany up until and throughout most of World War II. They were cosmetic, they were symbolic, they were held to create the illusion of a nation not under an authoritarian regime. You lose a democratic republic gradually and then suddenly. Right now, Washington is run by the president and the Supreme Court. The House and Senate is they're controlled by Republicans, which means they rubber stamp whatever it is Trump tells them to do. Republicans like Murkowski from Alaska will challenge the president occasionally, make it sound like there's some oversight, but unless the American people rise up legally and peacefully and say no to Trump and say yes to whatever it is the Democrats are offering, as lukewarm and distasteful it may seem, whatever the Democrats have to offer, take it. Unless you do that, our country enters the dark ages very quickly and sooner than you think. Mike Johnson, our speaker, says these court challenges to Trump's executive orders are out of control. He said desperate times call for desperate measures. Well, they weren't desperate until you guys took charge in January. Things were actually quite good when Biden was president and Chuck Schumer was running the Senate. Johnson now saying he's seriously considering defunding our courts in order to stop judges from legislating from the bench, as opposed to what we have right now, which is Donald Trump attempting to legislate from the Oval Office. It's not like Congress is doing any legislating. The only major bill coming out of this Republican Congress so far is lifting the cap on overdraft fees. Vox populi, the people have spoken. Yes, that's what America is clamoring for, to be charged $35 for a bounced check. Johnson is threatening right now to pass legislation that eliminates entire district courts. There's also a bill he plans to take up which would ban judges, federal judges, from issuing restraining orders that block executive orders. Mike Johnson, our speaker, calls himself a constitutional scholar, but there's no evidence of that, which is why he's also a man of faith. He doesn't need evidence. He's a believer. He believes in Jesus and himself. He believes, with no evidence, that he's a constitutional scholar. In her book, Liz Cheney writes that Johnson is almost functionally illiterate when it comes to our founding documents. But for Christian nationalists who call themselves constitutional scholars, being unfamiliar with the original texts works in their favor. What Jesus or our founding fathers actually said gets in the way of their agenda. Christian nationalists believe the Bible teaches us it's a cruel world filled with cruel people, and you have to be cruel to survive in it. That is what they teach. It's not what Jesus teaches. They consider themselves Christian warriors, and that has nothing to do with Jesus. White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt was interviewed over the weekend on the Christian Broadcasting Network.
It's warfare out there. In Christian terms, people will call what's happening in our country today spiritual warfare. Yeah. Do you see it in those terms, kind of good versus evil out there, and that context? How do you see that? I certainly believe in spiritual warfare, and I think I saw it firsthand, especially throughout the campaign trail with President Trump. Mm-hmm. And I think there certainly were evil forces, and I think that the president was saved by the grace of God on July 13th in Butler, Pennsylvania. And
he's in this moment for a reason. We're all here for a reason. And I think it's a miraculous thing that has taken place in our country.
I don't know how that happened. That is weird. I don't know how that happened. Meanwhile, the Trump administration filed an emergency appeal with the Supreme Court after a judge extended a temporary restraining order blocking Trump's executive order, invoking the Alien Enemies Act in order to deport to El Salvador Supermax prison Venezuelan migrants he has decided are gang members. No proof. U.S. District Judge James Boasberg blocked the 200-some-odd Venezuelan migrants from being flown to El Salvador, but the flights took off anyway. Judge Boasberg ruled that the men were denied due process and were entitled to administrative hearings, and he said they belonged in the United States. They are still in El Salvador. A Washington, D.C. Circuit Appeals panel upheld his decision last week, with one judge telling Trump's lawyer that Nazi prisoners of war were treated better than these migrants. Actually, Nazi prisoners of war were treated better than our black soldiers during World War II. This is true. During World War II, Nazi POWs, because they were white, got to eat with the officers, while black soldiers had separate dining accommodations. But that's for a different show. The point is, Nazi POWs were tendered more due process than these migrants we shipped to El Salvador. While Trump's lawyers insisted they were dangerous gang members, so far they've been unable to offer up any proof that they're criminals or gang members. So, if the Supreme Court decides to hear the appeal, two issues must be decided. First, can a president invoke the Enemy Alien Act, claiming undocumented immigrants who belong to gangs are enemy invaders? They have to decide, is Trump right? Are we at war? Is this an enemy invasion? And are Venezuelan migrants who belong to gangs enemy combatants? And two, if we are in fact in a state of war because of this wave of immigration, which by the time Biden left office was at a 5-year low, then does the president have the right, the authority to declare anyone he so chooses to be an enemy combatant without due process? Does a president get to decide when our nation is at war? With whom? Does he get to do it all by himself? Last time I checked the Constitution, no. But if he gets to decide we're at war, does he possess the right to unilaterally suspend habeas corpus, invoke the Alien Enemies Act, and round up anyone he wants? I need not remind my listeners that the last time a president invoked the Enemy Aliens Act was World War II in order to round up Japanese Americans, citizens, American citizens, not migrants, citizens, no due process, concentration camps. This, unless we speak up, this is where it's all heading. There is a third prong that the Supreme Court isn't being asked about yet, and that is why the Trump administration defied Judge Boasberg's order when he said the migrants stay here and are not to be shipped off to El Salvador. That's a whole other constitutional issue to be decided down the road. When a judge orders ICE or this administration not to do something, can the president ignore that judge's order? The answer is no. The answer is no. The problem is you have within this White House lawyers who consider Marbury versus Madison unconstitutional. Marbury versus Madison is the 1803 Supreme Court ruling establishing the precedent of judicial review, where the Supreme Court, short of a constitutional amendment, gets the last word on what is constitutional, gets the last word on what is justice. Venezuela's government has hired attorneys to file a habeas corpus petition demanding El Salvador explain why roughly 238 Venezuelan migrants living in the United States are now being held inside El Salvador's Supermax prison. Venezuela insists international law demands these men be released or be charged with a crime, which they have not been. It is against international law and American law to imprison anyone without due process, without charging them with the crime and offering them either a trial or at the very least a hearing before a judge, which these migrants were denied in both the United States and now El Salvador. During last week's hearings before the D.C. Circuit panel over whether the migrants were entitled to due process, government lawyers were asked if the men being shipped off to El Salvador were entitled to due process. Were they entitled to go before an administrative judge to prove they are not gang members or criminals, or to prove they are entitled to asylum? Lawyers for the Trump administration said yes, they are entitled to due process. So the judges asked, why weren't they brought before a judge? And Trump's lawyers said they didn't ask. Trump's lawyers told the judges that these migrants have rights, but they don't need to be advised of those rights by the United States government. So they didn't know to ask for an administrative hearing. Under the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment, everyone in this country, citizen or not, is entitled to due process, which means when you're detained by police or ICE, citizen or non-citizen, you are entitled to a hearing before a judge. If you're not a citizen, an immigration judge. You have the right to ask for asylum. You have the right to attorney. Now, unless you're an American citizen, an attorney will not be provided free of charge. But there are nonprofit organizations providing free counsel to migrants. In reality, 70% of migrants never get an attorney. And if they're apprehended within 100 miles of the border, their due process rights diminish drastically. Immigration officials pretty much have the authority to send them back if they're within 100 miles of the border. I know immigration law is Byzantine. Our immigration courts are complicated, understaffed, and overburdened. And the reason for that is that's the way big business wants it to be. Big business wants to be able to turn off and turn on the flow of cheap labor based on their needs at the time. If the economy is hot and they need cheap labor, let them in. If it's cold, keep them out. Now, up until Trump, that has been our immigration policy, basically strategic ambiguity when it comes to immigrants, so that when the economy heats up, there's no shortage of labor. But under Trump, the racism, the cruelty, the need to scapegoat supersedes what's best for our economy. What I find so infuriating is Democrats, especially Biden, when he owned the bully pulpit, didn't teach the American people we need these migrants. I'm going to read you something a little later on, some facts and figures, and your head is going to explode. It's not just the migrants we're punishing. I'm going to read you something. It's from the New York Times, some stats from the New York Times. It's not just the migrants we're punishing ourselves. More on all that in a second. But I want to address the legality of locking these migrants up, sending some of them to a supermax prison in El Salvador where they're being tortured. Let's be clear, okay? Unlike Donald Trump, none of these migrants that were shipped off to El Salvador are criminals. Donald Trump is a convicted felon. None, and I mean none, of the migrants sent to that El Salvador prison are criminals. Not one. If they were criminals, they would have already been inside American jail or prison. The Trump administration isn't telling us much about these men. But we know ICE isn't going into prisons, American prisons, and saying, where are the Venezuelan migrants? We need to send them down to El Salvador. They're not doing that. They're just rounding up heavily tattooed people of color and calling them gang members. None of these men we sent to El Salvador were convicted or even charged with a crime. Get this through your thick skull, America. None of the men we sent to El Salvador were convicted or even charged with a crime. Not a single one of them. ICE decided by themselves that these guys are gang members. It is not against the law, by the way, to belong to a gang. It's against the law to engage in gang activity, but it's not against the law to be a sworn member of, say, the mafia. You can be a made guy, but until you commit an actual crime, you can't be charged with anything. Even the Texas ICE field officer testified before Judge Boasberg that many of the migrants sent to El Salvador are not criminals. Many? How about none? None of them are criminals. If they were criminals, they'd already be in prison. They'd already be charged with the crime. None of them were charged with the crime. None of them are criminals. Okay? We would know what the crime is. ICE would tell us. They can't. ICE refuses to issue any crime reports about these men because there are none. These men were rounded up by ICE. ICE was told by Trump. He fired the head of ICE, and he said, you got to put numbers on the board. And they were ordered, start rounding people up. And they did. They began rounding up based on tattoos and hearsay. Countless stories right now of these men with Michael Jordan tattoos, even Jesus tattoos. ICE agents looking at those tattoos and saying, that's proof you're a member of a criminal gang. And by the way, we shouldn't be saying, if this can happen to them, it can happen to us. That's not why this is morally repugnant. This should not be happening to anybody, period. This has nothing to do with it being a slippery slope or this being a dress rehearsal for a police state. It's wrong in and of itself because it's wrong. And by the way, if you're a person of color, America has always been a police state. What's going on right now is Whitey is starting to get scared. 2.5 million people behind bars, most of them nonviolent, most of them poor, disproportionately non-white, denied a trial. They all plea out to get their sentences lowered without a trial. Now, Whitey's worried about a police state. It's always been a police state for people of color. Kristi Noem, the head of Homeland Security, paid a visit to that Supermax prison in El Salvador where men are stripped down to their underwear, head shaven, and stuffed into overcrowded cells subject to torture, just one meal a day, little to no medical attention. She goes down there and the first thing she says to herself is, photo op. She used it as a photo op to show off her new teeth, which she got illegally by using her title as governor to get free dental work down in Texas in exchange for a commercial endorsement for the dentist who performed the dental work on her. That's against the law, by the way. She should be in that Supermax prison behind bars. You're not allowed to be a governor and decide you want free dental work and then get it by bartering. Governors can't do commercials for dentists in exchange for new teeth, Kristi Noem. Anyway, according to Mother Jones, that Supermax prison Noem used as a photo op has 80 inmates to a cell. The lights are on constantly. If you're sent into solitary, then there's zero lighting. It's absolute darkness. Noem, who brags about taking her overly friendly puppy to a gravel pit and shooting it dead, she used these prisoners as props, standing there wearing night makeup with her hair flowing deliciously over the front of her shirt like it was a photo shoot for Maxim. In her video, she says this prison is where people go when, quote, you commit crimes against the American people. No, it's not. It's not where you go. This is against the law. And none of these men who were sent to that prison are criminals. You would think the head of our Department of Homeland Security would know this. If they were prisoners, if they were criminals, they would already be in an American prison. If they were criminals, they would have been charged with a crime. ICE and Trump have provided zero evidence that they have committed any crimes. And being in America, Kristi Noem, without proper documents doesn't make you a criminal. Stop saying that. Stop saying it's against the law. It's a crime to be in this country without documents. Being in America without a green card, without a visa, without documentation, being in this country without papers is not a criminal violation under federal law. It is a civil violation, which means you don't go to prison. Getting caught, however, in the act of sneaking into the country, that's a misdemeanor. That's a misdemeanor. Let me repeat. If you're in this country without documents, you're not illegal. You can't be arrested because it's not a crime. If you are caught sneaking into the country, if you're caught in the act of sneaking into this country, that is a misdemeanor. And we don't lock up people for misdemeanors. Nobody is in this country illegally. This is Florida Republican State Senator Jay Collins, who represents the bad people of Tampa. He just introduced Senate Bill 918, which addresses the labor shortages associated with keeping people from coming into our country. If Senate Bill 918 is signed into law, children in Florida as young as 14 could work overnight shifts, even on school days, and would eliminate mandatory meal breaks for child workers as well. Basically, it's allowing children to work full-time, which I thought we got rid of in the first 5 years of the 20th century. He says, Florida Republican State Senator Jay Collins says, passage of this bill is necessary to protect parental rights and to keep the government from dictating what's best for our children. Parental rights, yeah. See why they banned critical race theory from being taught in Florida's public schools? They don't want white kids to find out slavery was abolished. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis supports the bill. He said, quote, "What's wrong with expecting our young people to be working part-time now? That's how it used to be when I was growing up. Yeah, and look how well-adjusted you turned out to be. You sadistic little prick, Ron DeSantis." It's not part-time. They're talking about having kids work the overnight shift on a school day, school night. By the way, here is Ron DeSantis, that sadistic little prick, playing dress-up as a soldier. Right after graduating from Harvard Law, DeSantis served as a Navy Judge Advocate General, a JAG officer, and he did deploy to Iraq, but hid behind the Green Zone. He didn't see any combat. He's not a combat veteran. He just plays one on TV. He was a lawyer, not a soldier. Basic training for a Navy JAG officer is 5 weeks. And all you have to do to become a JAG officer is run 1.5 miles in under 13 minutes. That's basically it. Navy JAGs are never issued weapons because they receive little to no training in the use of them. But that didn't stop Ron DeSantis from playing dress-up, from doing a photo shoot when he was stationed down in Guantanamo Bay, where as a Navy JAG officer, he approved the force feeding of inmates, in direct violation of the Geneva Conventions, and, according to some reports, laughed hysterically while watching as inmates were being tortured. which is why we can't put any of the masterminds behind 9/11 on trial. Can't do it. Can't try them because we tortured them. And when you torture, it doesn't hold up in court. That's why you're not supposed to torture. People say anything when you waterboard them. I would say Ron DeSantis is an American hero if I were being water tortured. If you were waterboarding me, I'd say, yes, Ron DeSantis is a combat veteran, and it's a shame that nobody appreciates him for the sacrifices he made serving in the Green Zone as a lawyer in Iraq. Waterboarding, torture, doesn't provide actionable intelligence. It's worthless. And whatever you say while you're being waterboarded, it doesn't hold up in court. But the torture, the force feeding that Ron DeSantis allegedly thought was so funny, it was never about fighting terrorism or saving lives. The point of the torture was the torture. Look at how this Trump administration delights in seeing these Venezuelan migrants stacked up down there in El Salvador, warehoused like cans of soup. Ron DeSantis, anyway, I digress sometimes. He is the guy who thinks education isn't for everyone, which is why kids as young as 14 should be doing the overnight shift on school nights. Look, I have nothing against kids working. I pumped gas in high school. But these Republicans are not proposing child labor as a way to augment education. They're proposing child labor because they're stripping parents of a social safety net, and they want kids to get to work in lieu of educating them. People like Ron DeSantis don't believe education is for everyone. They believe the sooner we get those kids for whom education isn't the answer into the workforce, the better. They don't need to be educated. Get them to work. There is a labor shortage in the state of Florida. Some estimates say for every 100 jobs, there are only 53 people who can fill them. This is making it harder to find people to make our food, pick our lettuce, our tomatoes, slaughter our beef. It's slowing down construction. But Elon Musk says undocumented immigrants are sneaking into our country, not only to vote, but to destroy our social safety net. He is saying, without any evidence, millions and millions of undocumented Americans are stealing Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. He said we could save billions, if not trillions, if we crack down on fraud. And that's a lie. Okay? This is from Linda Quee. She writes for the New York Times. She wrote an article entitled Assessing Elon Musk's Misleading Claims About Fraud in Government Spending. It's Linda Quee. She wrote it for the New York Times, March 28th, 2025. I'm going to read this parts of it to you because it's just so infuriating when you have liars in this country and a nation of people who just don't read. They believe the liars. This is the truth. It's from the New York Times. So he's claiming migrants are stealing our social safety net. This lacks evidence. Unauthorized immigrants are not eligible for most federal safety net benefits, and there is no evidence to suggest they are committing fraud en masse to obtain them. In fact, a number of independent and government analysis suggests that the opposite is true. Unauthorized immigrants pay more into Social Security and Medicare than they receive in federal benefits. Federal law bars unauthorized immigrants from receiving Social Security or Medicare benefits, as well as most other federal government assistance programs. But they do pay taxes. In a 2013 report, the Social Security Administration estimated that 3.1 million unauthorized immigrants were working and paying Social Security taxes, contributing about $12 billion to the trust in 2010 and about $100 billion over a decade. A 2016 study estimated that unauthorized immigrants contributed about $35 billion to Medicare from 2000 to 2011. A 2024 study from the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy, a left-leaning think tank, found that unauthorized immigrants paid nearly $100 billion in federal, state, and local taxes in 2022, including $25.7 billion in Social Security taxes and $6.4 billion Medicare taxes. And the Congressional Budget Office estimated last summer that the surge in immigration from the 2021 to 2026 period would actually decrease the federal deficit by about $900 billion over a decade. The Budget Office projected that those recent migrants and their children will receive $300 billion in federal benefits, but they will more than offset those costs by bolstering tax revenues by $1.2 trillion. There is no evidence of mass entitlement fraud perpetrated by unauthorized immigrants. A 2018 report from the Niskanen Center, a libertarian-leaning think tank, noted that since 2011, there are fewer than 100 annual prosecutions of unauthorized immigrants where fraud was the leading charge. So, there's the truth, and there's what Republicans say. We need these migrants. They actually prop up our social safety net. I've been telling you this for years, that if we don't have more people paying in to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, if we don't have more people in this country working and propping up this house of cards we call an economy, we're going to go into a permanent state of recession. But hatred, racism, that now supersedes what's good for our country. This is why fascism always fails. I'm David Feldman, reminding you to stay strong and protect the weak. Please like this episode so I remain in your feed. Please share it with your friends. Please subscribe to this channel, my newsletter. Please hit the notification bell. I'll see you tomorrow.